December 28, 1944. 12 days had passed since hell itself erupted in the Ardennes forest. American soldiers lay dying in the merciless snow around Bastogne, their blood freezing before it could stain the ground. And in his headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower sat motionless at his desk, staring at a memo that made his hands tremble, not with fear, but with a fury so cold and calculated it could have frozen the room. The memo hadn't come from the German High Command. No, this betrayal came from within, from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, his own subordinate, his supposed ally, and the demand contained within those pages, it was as insulting as it was unthinkable. Montgomery was demanding that Eisenhower immediately relieve American commanders of the 1st and 9th Armies, not because they were losing battles, not because they were cowards, but because, according to Montgomery, they had failed to keep their men's feet dry. Let that sink in for a moment. While the 101st Airborne, exhausted, battered, pushed beyond all human limits, held the line at Bastogne in a desperate fight for survival, their own ally sat in a warm headquarters office, typing up an indictment of their leadership. To Eisenhower, this wasn't just criticism. This was treachery, a dagger in the back during a life-or-death struggle. He read the memo again, praying he had misunderstood, but the words remained unchanged. Montgomery was arguing that American generals were morally unfit to command because they couldn't manage basic soldier welfare. But there was something even more dangerous lurking beneath those clinical words. Montgomery wasn't just critiquing, he was maneuvering, building a calculated case to strip the United States of command authority over its own armies. Montgomery's memo was surgical in its contempt. He laid out the evidence like a prosecutor building a case. American units were suffering from trench foot at epidemic rates, 3 times higher than British forces, more than 45,000 cases and counting. Men losing toes, feet, entire legs to frostbite. But trench foot isn't just a statistic on a medical report. It's agony. It's permanent tissue damage born from weeks of relentless exposure. It's a 19-year-old boy realizing he'll never walk again because his commander prioritized ammunition over dry socks. Montgomery viewed this as proof of amateurism. But in judging the generals, he was also dismissing the misery of the men suffering in the mud. This wasn't a supply problem, Montgomery insisted. It was a leadership problem. British units operating in the same frozen hell, enduring the same brutal weather, had 1/3 the casualty rate. The evidence seemed damning. American soldiers were surviving on K rations for 30 days straight, rations designed to sustain a man for 3 days at most. They slept in frozen foxholes without rotation. Their socks remained wet for weeks on end. To Montgomery, this proved that American generals were nothing more than businessmen in uniforms. They moved resources around like factory managers, but ignored the professional craft that kept soldiers alive in the field. War, he believed, wasn't a corporate logistics exercise. It required discipline and grip that industrial might could never replace. But for Montgomery, this wasn't just about medical statistics. This was opportunity. He was weaponizing an epidemic of frozen American feet to restructure the entire Allied command. Montgomery summarized his contempt in language that cut deeper than any tactical criticism. He viewed the Americans not as professional soldiers, but as amateurs, businessmen playing dress-up, children stumbling through a game they didn't yet understand. While he was careful in public, his private diaries and memos to Churchill revealed the truth. He believed the Green American Command was a liability to the professional British war effort. The memo reached Churchill with a clear implication. If American commanders couldn't handle basic welfare, they had no business wielding strategic command. Montgomery wanted to transform the temporary authority he held in the North into a permanent British-led hierarchy. For a professional soldier, being called an amateur isn't merely an insult. It's a judgment that you lack the basic competence to do your job. And Montgomery was about to take this accusation directly to Winston Churchill himself. Montgomery's confidence wasn't baseless. It was rooted in British doctrine, a system that treated soldier survival as a science. From mandated tea breaks to strict rotation schedules, the British approach was methodical, calculated, designed for endurance. Most importantly, the British enforced rigid discipline around preventive care. Dry socks weren't optional. Officers inspected soldiers' feet daily. Men who neglected their equipment faced punishment. But there was another factor: driving this doctrine. Britain was running out of men. By 1944, every casualty mattered because there weren't unlimited replacements waiting. The British couldn't afford to lose soldiers to preventable causes. This wasn't cowardice. It was the mathematics of survival. The British soldier was a disciplined professional in a system designed to win a war of attrition with dwindling numbers. When Montgomery looked at American casualty rates, he saw waste, a preventable crisis that proper leadership could have stopped. During some weeks in November 1944, American units recorded more non-battle casualties from trench foot than combat casualties from German fire. To him, this proved one thing: American generals were playing at war. In early January 1945, Montgomery sent a private letter to Churchill. The language was even more direct than his memo to Eisenhower. American generals were butchers who didn't know how to look after their men. Montgomery argued that the welfare crisis vindicated his broader strategic vision. American aggression was causing unnecessary suffering, and the broad front strategy needed to be abandoned immediately. His solution was elegantly simple: give him command of all Allied forces north of the Ardennes, and give him their supplies. Montgomery wasn't just asking to lead American men. He was asking Eisenhower to starve Patton and Bradley's offensives, to redirect fuel and ammunition away from American advances to feed the British war machine. He was using welfare arguments to justify crippling the American offensive. Churchill read the letter with mounting alarm. He understood exactly what Montgomery was asking: subordinate American armies to British, gauge command and claim credit for winning the war. But Churchill didn't shut it down. Instead, he told Montgomery to be patient, to let events prove his case. General Omar Bradley learned about Montgomery's memo within hours. The Allied command structure leaked like a sieve. His reaction was immediate and volcanic. He told Eisenhower he would rather resign than serve one more day under Montgomery's authority. Bradley, known as the soldier's general, carried the weight of every casualty notification. His own decisions at the Hurtgen Forest haunted him still. For Montgomery to suggest he didn't care for his men wasn't just a professional slight, it was a knife to the soul. Bradley wasn't angry about the welfare criticism itself. He was furious about the hypocrisy. Montgomery was lecturing about soldier care while his own operations were burying British paratroopers by the thousands. The man preaching about dry socks had just presided over one of the war's costliest disasters. Bradley made his position crystal clear. If Eisenhower gave Montgomery command of American armies, he would resign and make certain every newspaper in America knew exactly why. George Patton's response to Montgomery's criticism was simpler and more brutal. He told his staff, "Montgomery wants American soldiers comfortable in trenches. I want them home by Christmas." The American philosophy was fundamentally different from British doctrine. American generals believed the most humane thing a commander could do was end the war as quickly as possible. 6 months of aggressive operations would save more lives than 2 years of careful welfare management. Patton didn't view trench foot as acceptable. But he viewed a stationary army as far worse. To him, every day a soldier sat still was another day a German 88mm gun could find his range. Speed wasn't just a tactic, it was a life-saving measure. This meant accepting short-term hardship for long-term gain. American units pushed forward until they ran out of fuel. They ate K-rations cold because hot meal trucks couldn't keep pace with the advance. They slept in mud because stopping to build proper camps meant giving the Germans time to regroup. The statistics Montgomery cited were real. American units did have higher trench foot rates, but American units also advanced at speeds Montgomery's forces never matched. They covered ground in weeks that British operations took months to secure. Patton's Third Army covered 400 miles in 1 month during the breakout from Normandy. They liberated French cities faster than supply trucks could follow. They reached positions the Germans thought would take months to threaten. This speed had a cost. Units constantly outran their supplies. Tanks sat idle waiting for fuel. Soldiers ate whatever they could scrounge. The staggering medical toll Montgomery fixated on was partly the result of units moving too fast to establish proper camps. But the speed also shortened the war dramatically. Every week of rapid advance was a week the Germans couldn't use to build defenses. Every breakthrough prevented the Wehrmacht from stabilizing lines that would cost thousands more lives to breach later. American intelligence officers estimated that Patton's August 1944 advance alone shortened the war by 3 to 6 months. If Montgomery's methodical approach had been used instead, the war would have extended well into 1946. How many soldiers would have died in those extra months? How many more casualties would have resulted from attacking prepared German defenses instead of catching them in retreat? The math was brutal, but clear. 45,000 cases of trench foot versus potentially hundreds of thousands of combat deaths from a longer war. The numbers destroyed Montgomery's entire argument. He pointed to more than 45,000 American trench foot casualties as proof of incompetent leadership. Yes, those casualties were real, and yes, they were preventable with better discipline. But every single one of those soldiers recovered. Trench foot wasn't fatal. Most men returned to duty within weeks. The casualties were temporary, painful, but survivable. Montgomery was using non-fatal injuries as evidence of moral failure. Now compare that to Market Garden, Montgomery's professionally planned operation that would supposedly end the war by Christmas. 17,000 casualties in 9 days, dead, captured, or permanently disabled. The 1st British Airborne Division was dropped at Arnhem with no realistic plan for relief. They held the bridge for 9 agonizing days against German armor. Fewer than 2,000 men escaped. The rest were killed or captured. The division ceased to exist as a fighting force. There's a haunting irony here. Montgomery was obsessed with the welfare of American feet, yet he had presided over the destruction of the finest paratroopers Britain ever produced. The men at Arnhem didn't need dry socks. They needed a plan that didn't abandon them to a meat grinder. Those weren't temporary casualties that could be prevented with better sock discipline. Those were men committed to an operation that had almost no chance of success. Professional planning had put British paratroopers into a killing ground. So who was the real butcher? The general whose men had cold feet but won their objectives, or the general who dropped paratroopers into a death trap for a bridge that led nowhere? Montgomery never acknowledged this comparison. He continued to lecture about American welfare while the catastrophic toll paid for his flawed operations exceeded anything American forces experienced from preventable injuries. Montgomery's memo was the opening shot. His January 7th press conference was the final insult. He stood before reporters and claimed he had saved the Americans at the Bulge. He described finding American forces in disarray and personally organizing the defense that stopped the German offensive. He talked about battles he had handled. Not battles the Americans handled. His battles. He was taking credit for soldiers who had fought and bled in the snow at Bastogne. The man who had lectured about dry socks was now stealing glory from the dead. The reaction was explosive. Bradley told Eisenhower this was the final straw. The alliance itself was fracturing. Churchill was forced to intervene with a speech in Parliament on January 18th, praising American sacrifice and making clear the Battle of the Bulge was overwhelmingly an American victory. Churchill understood that while Montgomery was a brilliant, tactical mind, he was a diplomatic catastrophe. The Prime Minister wasn't just saving Eisenhower's feelings, he was saving Britain's future relationship with the world's emerging superpower. Even Montgomery's own Chief of Staff, Major General Francis de Guignand, had to give him an ultimatum. Apologize to Eisenhower or lose your command. Montgomery was stunned. He genuinely believed he had been giving proper credit to Allied cooperation. But the damage was done. Montgomery had lectured Americans about caring for their men while presiding over Market Garden's destruction of British paratroopers. And now he was stealing credit for American victories won in the snow. The welfare argument was dead. The only question left was whether history would vindicate Montgomery's methodical approach or the American doctrine of speed at any cost. The final verdict came from the calendar. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Military historians have since calculated what would have happened if Montgomery's methodical approach had been used instead of American aggressive doctrine. If Allied forces had advanced at Montgomery's preferred pace, securing supply lines, rotating troops properly, the war would have extended into late 1945 or early 1946. The Germans would have had additional months to fortify defensive positions along the Rhine and in the Ruhr. Breaking those prepared defenses would have cost tens of thousands of additional casualties. Every week the war continued meant more V-2 rockets hitting London, more lives lost to the horrors of occupation, more cities destroyed by fighting, more families receiving death telegrams. American speed doctrine didn't just shorten the war, it determined how many people would survive to see liberation. The camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen were liberated in April and May 1945, extending the war by 6 months. Would have meant those camps continued operating through the fall. Every day of delay was measured in lives that could have been saved. In the spring of 1945, time was the only currency that mattered. For every day Montgomery wanted to wait for proper supply lines, the daily toll of lives lost in the camps continued to mount. For every hour Patton's amateurs pushed through the night without sleep, a few more lives were snatched back from the brink. The American doctrine of accepting short-term hardship to achieve rapid victory was vindicated by this timeline. Yes, the frostbite crisis was significant. But hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home alive in May 1945, instead of dying in battles that never had to be fought. Montgomery's welfare doctrine would have kept British soldiers more comfortable in the short term, but it would have gotten far more men killed in the long term by extending the war. Professional SOC management wasn't more important than strategic speed. The most devastating verdict came from German generals interviewed after the war. They confirmed that American operational tempo prevented them from establishing defensive lines. Every time they tried to dig in, American forces were already pushing past their positions. German commanders like Model and von Rundstedt were baffled by Montgomery's methodical pace, which gave them precious time to prepare defenses that cost thousands of Allied lives to break. If you ask a veteran of the Ardennes what mattered more, a hot meal in a trench or a ride home on a victory ship, the answer is obvious. Montgomery prioritized a war of methodical safety. The Americans prioritized a war of strategic speed. History, why doesn't remember who had the driest socks? It remembers who ended the nightmare.